Now, after months of simmering tensions at the Ukrainian border, things seem to be heading towards what many would describe as a possible tipping point. Now, on the surface, all nations involved in this conflict, including Russia, Ukraine and also the United States, with its NATO allies, have been calling for calm and restraint. But on the ground, things are moving at a pretty brisk pace. In the latest, the American President Joe Biden held virtual crisis talks with European leaders on how to possibly deter Russia from attacking Ukraine. He declared that there was total unity between the United States and its allies.
I had a very good meeting, total unanimity with all the European leaders. We'll talk about it later. Thank you.
Now, across the Atlantic, NATO's chief Jens Stoltenberg has also echoed a very similar message that transatlantic unity was important in dealing with the crisis. But he's also had this warning for Russia.
We are considering to further enhance our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. This could include the deployment of additional NATO battle groups. These deployments are proportionate and in line with our international commitments, and they reinforce European security for all of us. At the same time, NATO remains ready to continue dialogue with Russia. Let me be clear, NATO will not compromise on core principles. We stand for the right of each nation to choose its own alliances, and NATO's door remains open.
While NATO has reiterated that it remains willing to continue with dialogue with Russia, it's also not going to sit back and do nothing. That, of course, was the message from Jens Stoltenberg, who said that NATO is ready for any deterioration in the crisis, including strengthening of their collective defense. So far, NATO has about 4,000 troops stationed in Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia and Poland. They're backed by tanks, air defenses and also intelligence and surveillance units. And the United States, interestingly, besides the NATO troops, has also got as many as about 8,500 of its troops on high alert. Though at this point of time, they've not yet been deployed on the Eastern European frontier.
Secretary Austin has placed a range of units in the United States on a heightened preparedness to deploy, which increases our readiness to provide forces if NATO should activate the NRF or if other situations developed. All told, the number of forces that the Secretary has placed on heightened alert comes up to about 8,500 personnel.
Now, these developments have come after 4 rounds of talks between the United States and Russia and the other NATO allies. And these negotiations so far have not yielded any concrete results. As things stand, Russia maintains that it has no plans of invading into Ukraine. And Moscow has said that the West is actually just reacting to mass hysteria. This despite the fact that at least about 100,000 of the Russian troops have been stationed along the eastern borders with Ukraine. And also Moscow has clearly spelled out some of the security demands that it wants the West to fulfill. And one of these is that it wants the NATO military alliance to pull back its troop deployment from the former communist nations in Eastern Europe. Washington has said that while complying to such a demand is simply out of the question, it is ready to discuss other ideas such as arms control and also missile deployments. Russia is also waiting for a written American response to its clear security demands that it has put forth. Remember, Moscow sent in as many as about 20 Russian naval vessels into the Baltic Sea for its drills. And Russia's defense ministry has also released footage of its army loading flat cars with military hardware to send to Belarus for joint drills that are to be held this week. Now, amidst these developments, Ukraine, meanwhile, has called for calm and restraint, saying that it sees no signs of any kind of a full-scale attack. Ukraine has also deployed multiple launch rocket systems and tank units to the Donbas region. This, as Britain has said, that it is withdrawing some of its staff and also its dependents from its embassy in Ukraine. And interestingly, the United States has also said that it is ordering for the family members of the diplomats to immediately leave Kiev.
І ще раз наголошую, ми маємо зберігаємо спокій. Ми на сьогоднішній день не бачимо тої ситуації, яка на сьогоднішній день дуже в великих обсягах розмовляється в засобах масової інформації. Ми ще раз наголошуємо, ми не бачимо на сьогоднішній день жодних підстав для того, щоб сьогодні були твердження про повномасштабний наступ на нашу країну. Це неможливо зробити навіть фізично.
Comme je le soutiens depuis des mois, la bataille contre la pandémie se déroule sur tous les continents.
The French government has also announced that Russian officials will meet with their Ukrainian counterparts along with French and German counterparts in Paris. And they'll do this on Wednesday to try and find a way out of the impasse.
Comme je le soutiens depuis des mois, la bataille contre la pandémie se déroule sur tous les continents. Cela signifie que chaque continent doit être en capacité de développer.
All right, now to give us more insights in terms of how this very fast evolving situation, of course, is moving forward, we're joined in by our correspondent, Rosie Burchard, who's joining us live from Brussels. Thank you very much indeed, Rosie, for joining us in this broadcast on WION. Now, what we are witnessing is that, on the one hand, there are negotiations that are continuing. Last week, we saw Anthony Blinken and Sergei Lavrov meet in Geneva. But now what we're looking at is an increased deployment by the NATO and the United States. What are we to read in this?
Well, here in Brussels, European leaders are trying to portray a very united approach to this crisis based on three main goals: to try and pursue a diplomatic solution, to provide support to Ukraine, but also to stand ready to impose massive sanctions should any invasion occur. And alongside NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg, several EU allies took part in this transatlantic teleconference late last night with US President Joe Biden. They emerged from that again with a line of true unity and once again reissuing that threat to Russia that sanctions would be on the table and would be imposed should any incursion occur. Now, however, EU leaders are in some ways behind closed doors, we believe, struggling to find a truly united approach on certain areas of this. So we know, for example, that when it comes to the transfer of weapons and lethal weapons in particular, Germany has exposed itself as an outlier there. So Europe is definitely trying to pursue a united approach, particularly this transatlantic unity to be portrayed. However, we know that there may be some divisions behind closed doors which, should there be an invasion, that could slightly weaken Europe's hand here.
Absolutely, indeed. That's an important point that you brought up. You know, the fact in terms of how Germany is positioning in this crisis. On the face of it, NATO allies and Europe and the United States, they've all been trying to project a united front. But is Germany completely on board? One, you mentioned about the transfer of weapons to the frontiers along Eastern Europe, but also on the issue of financial sanctions and the very contentious issue of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Is Germany on board to, in fact, respond to this crisis in case of an incursion by the Russians?
Well, Germany definitely says it is on board to respond. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, was part of that transatlantic video call last night. And when Annalena Baerbock, the German Foreign Minister, was in Brussels yesterday, she also stressed that her strong solidarity and support to Ukraine. Now, Olaf Scholz last week hinted that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, that controversial pipeline you mentioned, which, if certified, would transfer gas from Germany into Russia, he hinted that might indeed be on the table, which was welcome news to several other European allies and EU members that have been pushing for that, not least the Baltics, that traditionally have a harder line when it comes to Russia. So that was welcome news. However, it's still unclear whether that, in which way and whether and how this could truly be on the table. And as you can imagine, here in Brussels, diplomats are incredibly tight-lipped on what those sanctions might actually entail. They don't want to give anything away to Moscow, lest it weaken their hand in these negotiations. As you said, talks continue. Despite all this rising tension, no side seems ready yet to throw in the towel. The diplomacy continues. We're expecting more talks tomorrow, and we're expecting more talks between the US and Russia soon enough. So where this really lands, it's hard to tell, but no side yet willing to really back down and throw in the towel. The diplomacy continues.
Absolutely indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Rosie Burchett, for joining us from Brussels and getting us all those insights. So on the one hand, there is diplomacy that continues, and on the other, very worryingly, there's also a troop build-up. Russia already has got about 100,000 soldiers stationed on the eastern border with Ukraine, and now the Americans and its NATO allies are also ramping up, slowly but steadily, their troop presence as well in Ukraine. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.